I know you've been here, Bob. Yeah, a couple folks have been here. This is one of those spots that exists, yet very few people really know about it for obvious reasons. You don't pull in off of Route 3 necessarily to see historic sites here. But this does exist, and the reason it exists is right here in front of us. This small little mound, or I should say line of a mound. These are earthworks and these are trenches that were built during the Chancellorsville campaign. They were never used. There was never any fighting that took place behind them, but they have survived for 150 years. 150 years and one day, to be exact, that these have been here. But this is an excellent place to begin a discussion of the Battle of Chancellorsville and the campaign from the Confederate perspective. If you look at your maps, we are located right now upon a ridge line that is known as the Zoan Church Ridge. And if you look in the center of your map, along the Orange Turnpike, the primary road that runs east-west, left to right through your map, you will see Zoan Church. Zoan Church today is on the other side of the Orange Turnpike, modern-day Route 3. And so we are just to the north here. And it was a very prominent ridge and still is. As we head out, after leaving here onto the bus and we get back on Route 3, if you look to your left and your right, you'll see that coming from the east, from Fredericksburg, which is about 6 miles to our east, from Fredericksburg, you will see that the road climbs up to this ridge where we are right now. And this would become a Confederate position in the early stages of the Battle of Chancellorsville. Now, as I said, the tour this morning is to give you the background, explain why the armies were doing what they were doing, and how they got here into the Chancellorsville area for the opening clash, and the very first time during the campaign that the armies actually came together on the field on May 1st. The winter of 1862 to 1863. Oftentimes when we look at it and what's going on in the armies, we have a tendency to focus on the Union Army. The Union Army had suffered a tremendous defeat at Fredericksburg. It had been a rough winter for them. And it was a rough winter also for the Confederates, which we have a tendency not really to look at. We have a tendency to think that the Confederates were doing wonderfully. That summer of 1862, the Union Army began 1862, or the spring of 1862, working its way up to the doorstep of Richmond, the Confederate capital. And beginning in the late spring and all the way through the summer and the fall, it was nothing but Confederate battle, Confederate victory, Confederate victory, Confederate victory, one right after another. The Confederates pushed the Union Army away from Richmond. They moved their way up through Culpeper, off to our west. In August, defeating the Union Army at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, moving on to the Battle of Second Manassas, another victory for the Confederates, all the way up into Maryland in September for the Battle of Antietam. Technically, can be considered a draw. The Confederates fell back into Virginia, and then in December, they soundly thrashed the Union Army at the Battle of Fredericksburg. Things are looking wonderful for the Confederates. But that winter of 1862 to 63, it was a tough one for the Confederate Army. One of the reasons for that was the great attrition that had occurred. All of those battles took a tremendous toll on Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. And not only in men, but also in leaders and commanders. During the battles, temporary commanders were being put into place, temporary officers, to keep the army moving. But that winter, they had to make decisions about who would lead, who would take over these commands in these positions permanently. And if you go on any of the rest of the tours with us over the next few days, you're going to hear us use military terms. Corps, division, brigade, regiment, they're all military units. And a good way to remember the sequence is cloudy days bring rain. You have an army, and then you have a corps. Then under the corps, you have divisions. Under divisions, you have brigades. Under brigades, you have regiments. So cloudy days bring rain. It's a good way to remember the sequence. because we're going to be talking about corps, division, brigades, regiments all week long. But Robert E. Lee had to make decisions. He had a number of men who were missing, who were wounded or had been killed. And we often look at the Union Army and think about the intrigue, the infighting, the backbiting, things going on in the Union Army that just caused chaos. Well, the Confederacy wasn't immune to that at all. Robert E. Lee, the winter of 1862 to 63, was struggling with officers who couldn't get along. Poor decisions being made. And as a perfect example, we have to look at Stonewall Jackson. Jackson commanded a half of Robert E. Lee's army. He commanded a corps. There were two corps in Lee's army, Stonewall Jackson and James Longstreet. Jackson's going to figure prominently at Chancellorsville. James Longstreet isn't even here, so we probably won't talk about him much at all. But Jackson had very much difficulty in choosing his subordinates, and Robert E. Lee often had to intervene. If we look at what Jackson's corps was dealing with, his own personal old division, the division he had commanded during 1862, had been temporarily commanded by a general named Tolliver, William B. Tolliver. That winter, William B. Tolliver engaged in heated debates with one of his subordinates, Brigadier General Frank Paxton. Bull Paxton was from Lexington, Virginia, and was a very good friend of Stonewall Jackson's. He had actually served on Jackson's staff. Paxton was openly critical about his superior, about Tolliver. Openly critical, voicing his opinions about Tolliver to Lee as well as to Jackson. Tolliver obviously didn't appreciate that, and these two men were constantly at odds. Tolliver filed charges against Paxton. This is going on that winter. This is what Jackson and Lee have to deal with. Charges of insubordination. The result was Tolliver would be transferred out of the Army to South Carolina. And Paxton was Jackson's choice to move up to division command, move up from a brigade to a division. However, Robert E. Lee wouldn't have it. And so Isaac Trimble, a man who had been wounded at 2nd Manassas, was given permanent command of that division. He was elevated, he was promoted, and made a division commander. The problem was, Trimble was still wounded. And so the man that he put in his place was Brigadier General Raleigh Colston, who happened to be a VMI graduate, a VMI professor of French history and military strategy, and a close friend of Stonewall Jackson's. Jackson had a tendency to choose his friends as subordinates. Ambrose Powell Hill, another division commander under Stonewall Jackson. Hill and Jackson were constantly at each other, all fall 1862, to the point that A.P. Hill had actually been arrested by Jackson on the march north through Virginia on the way to 2nd Manassas. Hill had disregarded Jackson's marching orders, so Jackson had him arrested, sent to the rear of his column. And that was to march at the rear of your division was considered an affront by A.P. Hill. So, although charges were preferred, Jackson thought, as the battles went on, they were just forgotten. That winter, Hill brought the problem up. He wanted his name cleared. Lee hoped to sweep it under the rug. Wasn't happening. They were both Hill and Jackson were assembling information, assembling documents for a courts-martial that was going to take place when the Battle of Chancellorsville occurred. Stonewall Jackson and his division commander A.P. Hill were in the midst of this when the battle occurs and Stonewall Jackson's wounded. Jackson's other division commanders, Jubal Early. Jackson had him arrested on the march to Fredericksburg. Rumors had come in that Early was marching, coming over the mountains from the Shenandoah Valley on the way to Fredericksburg. He was moving slow and he was drunk. So Jackson had him arrested. The charges would be clear, but nonetheless, you kind of get the idea. Jackson's having trouble with some of his division commanders. Another division command under Jackson was one that had, at Fredericksburg, had actually been commanded by Jackson's brother-in-law, Daniel Harvey Hill. And Daniel Harvey Hill was not a great division commander. And that winter, Hill requested a transfer and Jackson granted it. So Jackson the Confederate Army having all this difficulty with personalities, trying to get an organization straight. But here at the Battle of Chancellorsville, there are going to be two men that stand out, and that's going to be Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. As I said, James Longstreet was not here. So you have a problem of command for Robert E. Lee during the winter of 1862-63. He's not only responsible for trying to feed his men, clothe his men, run an army, but he's dealing with subordinate officers who are constantly at each other's throats. That would create problems that winter for Robert E. Lee. Lee did something very important during the winter. He reorganized his artillery. The Confederate artillery, the cannons, they were distributed among the various divisions, brigades, and commands. That made it very difficult on a battlefield. When a battle was engaged and you have a artillery battery, 4 guns that are attached to a brigade, trying to get brigade commanders to work together to mass the artillery, bring the power together, was extremely difficult. Not only that, you had infantry officers who were dictating artillery tactics. That made it very difficult. So Lee reorganized his artillery, brought them together in battalions, large organizations, and distributed them among the corps. And what that did was each corps, each division, would have an artillery officer who would be responsible for the placement and the operation of those guns on the field. Extremely important, streamlining, reorganizing his artillery. The cavalry, the horsemen, not much had to be done. Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry commander, had been embarrassing the Union Army all year long in 1862. Twice he rode completely around the Union Army, and the Union cavalry were unable to stop him. Jeb Stuart, not much had to be done. But the most important thing affecting Confederates that winter was supplies. We're only 50 miles from Richmond. The railroad comes from Richmond to Fredericksburg. Richmond is the supply base for Virginia and Lee's army. With a railroad running right up to you, you'd think it'd be relatively easy. But the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad that ran from the Potomac River through Fredericksburg to Richmond, the RF&P was essentially a single line railway. Very few sidings. So if you've got a train heading northbound, it's very difficult to get one heading southbound. That's going to slow your ability to bring trains up. Essentially 1 train a day is going to be operating on that line. To make matters worse, the superintendent of the RF&P was Pennsylvania-born Samuel Ruth. And it would come out much later, Ruth was a Unionist sympathizer. Actually worked to thwart Robert E. Lee's efforts to supply his men. And so he was not doing everything in his power to make sure these supplies are coming. So Lee is having difficult times getting supplies. Just as an example, his army's animals, the horses and mules, required each day 90 tons of hay and 107 tons of corn. That's just for the horses and mules. And these trains also have to bring food for the men. They also have to bring supplies, clothing. And clothing was getting very scarce, to the extent that Hill's division in Jackson's Corps at one point were requesting 12,000 pairs of shoes and 400 blankets. So supplies were very scarce coming up. Food was getting so scarce that in January, Lee cut the daily ration for his men to 4 ounces of bacon and 18 ounces of flour. That was their daily ration. That's a third of what was supposed to be issued to the men. So supplies were becoming extremely difficult. In February 1863, the Union Army on the other side of the river in Stafford County, they send one of their organizations, the Union Army 9th Corps, down to Fort Monroe, southeast Virginia. There's a Union buildup going on down there. Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, and the cabinet and the Confederate Congress are getting worried about what's going on in their back door down there on the peninsula. And so Lee was forced to send James Longstreet and 2 of his divisions, about 17,000 men, down to counter that threat. So now Lee is having, and Stonewall Jackson is the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. He outranks Stonewall Jackson. So Lee is now losing his second in command and 17,000 men to head down to southeast Virginia. It eases the supply problem, but Lee's minus 17,000 men. So for Robert E. Lee, as The snows stop, the rains begin, spring is starting, active campaigning will occur. Robert E. Lee is unable, he's not capable of making any sort of offensive movement. That means he can't strike the Union Army because he can't build up a stockpile of supplies to take care of his men, and he's been robbed of a portion of his army. So Robert E. Lee knows going into the spring of 1863, he has to dance to the Union Army's tune. Robert E. Lee cannot make an offensive movement. And where are we sitting? 50 miles north of Richmond. Robert E. Lee can't go anywhere. He can't leave this area. If he heads south, he's just bringing the Union Army closer to Richmond. And they had spent all summer removing them from the Richmond area. So Robert E. Lee can't go south, and he can't attack because he doesn't have the resources. So Robert E. Lee is stuck in Fredericksburg in the winter of 1862, moving into 1863. The Confederate Army that Lee had available here after Longstreet leaves is about 61,000 men. And that's what he will have available for the Battle of Chancellorsville. He doesn't really know what he's facing across the river, but he's facing more than twice his number. There's over 135,000 Union soldiers on the other side of the river. So when we think about Robert E. Lee, as we head into the end of April of 1863, he's stuck here in Fredericksburg. There's nothing he can do. He can't move back. He certainly can't attack. He's got diminishing supplies. He has men being taken from his command. So when we think about all of the victories of 1862 that the Confederate Army had won, that was greatly diminished by the situation they were in the spring of 1863. And Robert E. Lee would be forced to dance to the tune dictated by Joseph Hooker and the Union Army on the other side of the river. To compound that, Robert E. Lee with 61,000 men is responsible for covering 25 miles of front. That means 25 miles along the Rappahannock River, all the way from Skinker's Neck, the Port Royal area to the south, all the way up to U.S. Ford on the north. And you should see U.S. Ford on your map there. Running from U.S. Ford down to Skinker's Neck, south of Fredericksburg and Port Royal down in Caroline County, roughly 25 miles, and he has to cover that with 61,000 men. And he has less than less than half of what his opponent sitting on the other side of the river has. So again, when we think about post-Battle of Fredericksburg and how both armies are feeling, the Union Army suffering tremendous morale issues after a year of devastating defeats on the battlefield and a bludgeoning that occurred on the heights west of Fredericksburg, but the Confederate Army isn't feeling a whole lot better. They're stuck in a situation that doesn't look very good and keeps getting worse every day. For Robert E. Lee, when he begins to understand what is going on in April of 1863, the Union Army is on the move. We're not here at this stop, we're not going to get into too much about what the Union Army is doing. We'll do that at our next stop. But here we'll talk about what Robert E. Lee knows and when he knows it as the Battle of Chancellorsville and the campaign begins. On April 13th, the Union cavalry, the horsemen, begin a ride north along the Rappahannock, heading west to the upper reaches of the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers. Their intention is to get around Lee's army to the west. That's all I'll tell you here. But their intention is to get around Lee's army to the far west. Lee knows what's happening. I mean, he has scouts. Jeb Stuart is a wizard at gaining information, and this is Confederate territory. So locals are providing information. And Lee knows that the Union cavalry is on the move, heading west. But he doesn't know where they're going, and he has no idea what their intention is. He has to wait and see. Unfortunately for the Unionists, the army on the other side of the river, heavy rains slow the cavalry down. And so you have a period of days, almost 2 weeks, in which the Union cavalry is stuck in quagmire trying to get to the upper reaches of the Rappahannock River. So for Robert E. Lee on April 13th, he knows the Union cavalry is moving. He knows they're heading north and west. But then a week, 2 weeks pass, and there's nothing. So what is going on? He's confused. He has to wait for more information. What he doesn't know is toward the end of April, the Union infantry, the foot soldiers, the bulk of the Union Army is also on the move, heading north and west. Lee doesn't find that information out until April 29th. On April 29th, information is received that the Union 6th and 1st Corps, in the Union Army Corps, which is the next level below the Army, the individual corps are identified by numbers. In the Confederate Army, the corps are identified by their commanders. And the 6th and 1st Union Corps, actually, on April 29th, they cross the river below Fredericksburg. And if you look on your map, you'll see some blue rectangles south of Fredericksburg. The 6th and 1st Corps actually crossed the river below Fredericksburg. At the same time, Lee receives information that Union infantry is crossing the Rapidan River at Germanna Ford. If you look on the west end of your map, you will see Germanna Ford. That's where Route 3 today crosses the Rapidan River. So Robert E. Lee on April 29th is sitting there looking at all this information. Well, I've got tens of thousands of troops that suddenly appear on the plains below Fredericksburg on the Confederate side of the river. Is that going to be the attack? Is that where they're coming? Well, wait a minute. What are these Union infantry doing all the way to the west? What do I do? What are my choices? Robert E. Lee decided on April 29th, essentially, I'm going to wait for this to develop. So Lee is flat-footed as the Union Army is making its movements and the campaign is beginning and the Union plans are beginning to unfold. The Union Army below Fredericksburg crosses, but they really don't make much of a threatening move. And that's going to influence Lee's decision. On April 29th, Lee had Confederate troops, about 8,000 men, under a general named Richard Herron Anderson. Anderson's a division commander. He was one of two divisions left here by Longstreet when Longstreet headed south. Anderson and Claus during this battle are going to be under the direct supervision of Robert E. Lee, since their corps commander Longstreet is not on the battlefield. Anderson is responsible for guarding these upper crossings on the Rapidan and Rappahannock River. U.S. Ford, Banks Ford, Ely's Ford, all of these shallow crossing points. And on April 29th, Lee informs Anderson, all right, we've got Federals off to the west and they're coming across the river. I need you to fall back and block the roads, all the roads that lead into Chancellorsville. I need you to get to Chancellorsville with your brigade, your 8,000 men, and cover that area. All roads lead to Chancellorsville. Block that intersection. By 9 p.m., Anderson had concentrated at Chancellorsville. He was covering the roads there that were heading north and west. But Anderson's a little uneasy, and we'll see why when we get there, about his position. So at 6 a.m. on April 30th, Richard Herron Anderson, with the understanding of Robert E. Lee, falls back from Chancellorsville to a better location. And that location's right where we're standing, Zoan Church Ridge. Up on this ridge to the west, ground slopes down. Up on this ridge, he can defend. He can defend the approaches to Fredericksburg, because Lee is still relatively uncertain about what is going on. That day, April 30th, things begin to develop. The picture becomes clearer. A full day passes and the Union forces below Fredericksburg that had crossed, they're just sitting there. They're not doing anything. They're not being aggressive. And they're not being reinforced. More troops aren't coming across the river. So Robert E. Lee begins to think, this might be a feint. These Union troops might be a ruse below Fredericksburg. He conferred with Stonewall Jackson, and Jackson's response is, let's attack them. Let's go attack those Federals below Fredericksburg. Lee asks him, are you sure you want to do that? And Jackson backs off. Because if the Confederates attack, all the Union cannon on Stafford Heights on the other side of the river would have just annihilated Jackson's troops. So Jackson, aggressive, but he backs off when Lee questions him on it. Lee sent a message to Jefferson Davis that day. He said, Meade, Slocum, and Howard, these are Union Corps commanders. He said, Meade, Slocum and Howard command corps, and he knows this because Jeb Stuart's operating off to the west, and he's picking up Union stragglers who are providing information. Object evidently to turn our left. The Union Army is going to be coming from the west, is what Lee is beginning to divine. If I had Longstreet's division, I would feel safe. And this is on April 30th. Interestingly, it would take 36 hours for that message to reach Longstreet, who's down near Suffolk, Virginia. No way Longstreet's going to get here in time. In fact, by the time Longstreet reads that message, the armies are fully engaged around Chancellorsville. Lee sent Anderson up here, the Army's chief engineer, to lay out this defensive position we see. These are the trenches Anderson was digging on April 30th. These are the remnants of the opening of the Chancellorsville campaign. Lee to Anderson at 2:30 on April 30th. I hope you have been able to select a good line and fortify it strongly. Set all your spades to work as vigorously as possible. I hope to send you additional troops if I can, so hold your position firmly and prepare your line for them. Remember, Lee can't go anywhere. He's got to stay in Fredericksburg. So Anderson's being told, dig in here, and this is where we're going to make our stand when they come from the west. This is where I determine to stop the Union Army and Joseph Hooker. Also, this is significant because this is the first time in 11 months that Robert E. Lee has commanded the Army of Northern Virginia that he orders his men to dig trenches on the battlefield. They dug trenches around Richmond, but that was not on the battlefield. Those were siege trenches to defend the capital. First time Robert E. Lee tells his men, dig in on the field. Very significant because it reflects Robert E. Lee's concern and feeling about his position, his depleted numbers, and where he is forced to fight a battle. Lee once more rode down to check on the Federals below Fredericksburg. Still not moving, nothing going on. They're just sitting down there. There's smoke fires, they're cooking. There's really no activity. At that point, Lee turned to his chief of staff and he said, the main attack will come from above. So on April 30th, the Union Army, which is already across the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers, on April 30th, the Union Army is already in the Chancellorsville intersection. That is when Lee realizes what the Union Army plan is. The Union Army literally stole a march on Robert E. Lee during the Battle of Chancellorsville. They got the bulk of the army behind Lee before Lee could figure out what their moves were. At that point, Lee ordered Lafayette McLaws, another division commander. This man had been left by James Longstreet, the other division that Longstreet did not take to Suffolk. About 12,000 men. He orders McLaws to move that evening here to support Anderson. He also orders Stonewall Jackson to march before daylight on March 1st to get up here to Anderson and support him. Robert E. Lee deciding the attack is coming from above, from the west, from the north, the upper reaches of the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. He is now sending his troops west to engage the Union Army on May 1st. Lee decides to leave 12,000 Confederates in Fredericksburg to watch the Union Army down there. Lee's not terribly concerned. Union forces down there have been there 2 days and they're really not doing anything. They're probably not going anywhere. They're probably there simply to try and keep Lee's attention focused while the remaining Union Army is getting around behind him. So Lee will order 12,000. The orders from Lee were to make arrangements to repulse the enemy. Dig in here and repulse the enemy. Lee and Jackson worked very well together, there's no doubt about that. And Lee had a lot of confidence in Jackson. And so while the orders had been dictated to Anderson and to McLaws, repulse the enemy here, Jackson had more leeway. Jackson arrived up here at 8:30 in the morning on May 1st. There were already Federals visible off to the west, already Union soldiers off to the west. Jackson looks up and down the line. It's going to be a couple hours before his divisions arrive because they left before daylight. It's going to take them a few hours to get out here. Jackson looks up and down the line and he decides, repulse the enemy here, we're going to attack the enemy on May 1st. Good defense, or good offense, good defense. He's going to attack try and take the Union Army and keep them off balance, but he has to wait a couple hours. By 10:30 a.m., 2 of Jackson's 3 divisions that are coming out are up. And now at 10:30 a.m., from this position up here on this rise, from behind these earthworks, Stonewall Jackson orders the Confederate Army forward into battle. And on May 1st, 150 years ago today, the Confederate troops left the cover of these trenches, marched out over them, and headed down across the fields to engage the Union Army and open the Battle of Chancellorsville. So that's the Confederate side of things, what is going on leading up to this initial clash. Well, we're up here just to explain why this is here, because this is interesting, obviously. We're standing in the midst of a commercial shopping center with a large high school off to our front. A number of years ago, the developers and planning occurred to create this commercial shopping center. Here in Spotsylvania County, we have a very good relation working between the county, developers, as well as preservationists, those interested in preserving the battlefields. When this shopping center was planned, you can see the stormwater management pond behind us. They were intruding, or possibly were going to intrude and disturb wetlands. And here, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, a federal agency, is responsible for those waters that flow into navigable waters and flow into the Chesapeake Bay. And so what happens up here can affect what happens down there. So the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has to issue a permit for the disturbance of wetlands in this area. And the federal government, any federal agency that is involved in a project, has to issue a permit, provides funds, provides land, has any involvement. Federal agencies, including the National Park Service, have to take into consideration not only is what their permit going to do to natural resources, but also historic resources. And this is part of the battlefield. And so if the Army Corps took into consideration this being part of the battlefield, and a deal was worked out with the developer of the shopping center, between the shopping center, the Army Corps as a federal agency, the National Park Service consulting as historians with the Army Corps of Engineers, Spotsylvania County government, that if this is built, we would like to see this saved. And so the developer has set aside these earthworks, and these earthworks are protected. They built the walkway up here, installed the signs and the parking. So this could have disappeared, but because of this relationship to try and protect, it's a sliver. I mean, we're staring at dozens of air conditioning units on top of Home Depot ball fields, but the earthworks that were important on April 30th are still here. And so this allows people to come up here and learn a little bit more. So we have preserved, through the cooperation of the county and the federal government and the developers, a little bit of land here. All right? And so with that, I've brought the Confederates onto the field. What's going on? We need to get to the bus. We're going to head to Ely's Ford, one of the places the Union Army crossed, and then we'll talk about what the Union Army is doing. There we go. All right, we're standing at Ely's Ford on the Rapidan River. Directly in front of us is obviously the Rapidan River, and this was a shallow point in the river. We could go down a little farther down, but it's muddy, it's very slippery, and the last time I ever stepped in the river rescue had to come get me out. So that was not on a tour, however. So we'll stay up here. You can take it at your own risk to go down and get pictures. But this is the Rapidan River in front of us, and you can find Ely's Ford on your maps, the first map, which shows the Union strategy. And that's what we're going to talk about here. What did the Union Army know, and what was it doing up to May 1st, 1863? 1862, previous year, as I mentioned back at our last stop, had been a very good year for the Confederates on the battlefield, which meant one thing. It had been a very bad year for the Union Army on the battlefield. The Union Army of the Potomac had fought again all the way up to the doorsteps of Richmond, and then been pushed all the way up into Maryland before coming back down to Fredericksburg in December. And the Army of the Potomac had obviously been bludgeoned at Fredericksburg. Attack after attack against Marie's Heights, the famous stone wall. Not a single man made it. A very brief penetration of Confederate lines on the south end of the field, but very quickly thrown right back out. Ambrose Burnside was the Union Army general at Fredericksburg and on into January of 1863. And there was tremendous discontent in the Army of the Potomac among its officers. In fact, a number of officers, high-ranking, including Joseph Hooker, were lobbying for Burnside's removal. They were, in fact, meeting with Abraham Lincoln, the president, expressing their displeasure with Ambrose Burnside in his handling of the Army and the total and utter lack of confidence that was felt within the Army from the private all the way up to the Corps commander with Ambrose Burnside. It was essentially a revolt. They said that if Burnside remains in command, the Army of the Potomac will be destroyed on the battlefield the next time it meets Robert E. Lee and the Confederate Army. Ambrose Burnside will destroy the Army of the Potomac on the battlefield. And that was their feeling. To make matters worse, while all this is going on, Burnside decides to do something which becomes known as the infamous Mud March. Burnside, having not been able to take Fredericksburg, decides to march his army in January up around the rivers to try and get around Robert E. Lee, similar to what Hooker would do in April and May. But if Burnside tries this in the midst of rain and snow, and the army literally bogs down. It can't move. To add to it, Confederates along this side of the river, on the Confederate side, are up on bluffs holding up sheets in which they were painted Burnside stuck in the mud. They were making fun of the Union Army on the other side. So all of this adds to the complete and utter lack of trust in Ambrose Burnside. Burnside finds out that these men in his army, these officers, are working against him. And on January 23rd, Burnside met with Abraham Lincoln up in Washington. And Burnside said, he requested. He didn't demand, he requested. He requested that that Lincoln dismiss those officers in his army. And he had a list of names, on which was Joseph Hooker. Dismiss these men from the army or accept my resignation. I can't command with this type of insubordination and men working against me. Lincoln met with some of his cabinet, came back the next day, met with Burnside, and he said, I am going to relieve you of command and transfer you to another post. Lincoln had enough respect for Burnside that he wasn't accepting his resignation. He wasn't going to allow him to leave the army. But he knew he had to replace him at the head of the army. No man can command the army who feels everybody below him is trying to get rid of him, is after him. If he has no respect among his officers, nothing will be accomplished. The man that he chooses to replace him with is Joseph Hooker, a man on Burnside's list to be banned from the army. Lincoln knew Hooker. He understood Hooker's character. In fact, Lincoln told on January 24th, when he makes this decision, he turned to one of his confidants and he said, Hooker does talk badly, but the trouble is, he is stronger with the country today than any other man. Burnside was extremely popular, and Burnside made sure he was popular. He loved to talk to the papers, so his name was everywhere throughout the North. Joseph Hooker. His nickname was Fighting Joe Hooker. Hooker was very popular. But Lincoln also understood that Hooker was undermining Burnside, and he couldn't stand for that to continue, that type of aggressiveness in a negative manner. And on January 26th, Lincoln wrote a fabulous, wonderful letter to Hooker. It's often been compared to a father chiding his son. But Hooker loved it. He loved the letter. And this is what Lincoln said. He said, I have placed you at the head of the Army of the Potomac. Of course, I have done this upon what appears to me to be sufficient reasons. And yet, I think it best for you to know that there are some things in regard to which I am not quite satisfied with you. I believe you to be a brave and a skillful soldier, which of course I like. I also believe you do not mix politics with your profession, in which you are right. You have confidence in yourself, which is a valuable, if not an indispensable quality. You are ambitious, which, within reasonable bounds, does good rather than harm. But I think that during General Burnside's command of the Army, you have taken counsel of your ambition and thwarted him as much as you could, in which you did a great wrong to the country and to a most meritorious and honorable brother officer. The government will support you to the utmost of its ability, which is neither more nor less than it has done and will do for all commanders. I much fear that the spirit with which you have aided to infuse into the Army of criticizing their commander and withholding confidence from him will now turn upon you. I shall assist you as far as I can to put it down. Neither you nor Napoleon, if he were alive again, could get any good out of an army while such a spirit prevails within it. And now, beware of brashness. Beware of brashness, but with energy and sleepless vigilance, go forward and give us victories. Abraham Lincoln's putting his army commander on notice. I know what you've been doing, but it can happen to you. So you need to be careful. And you need to create within this army a spirit that can take the field. And it was important for Hooker to do so because just as the Confederates were dealing with issues, the Union Army of the Potomac had its own issues. Desertion after Fredericksburg was extremely high. Union soldiers were leaving the army and heading home. A summer, an entire year, 1862, of defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat. Fredericksburg, a colossal defeat. And on January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, effectively changing the Union Army, the war aim, from reunification of the country to reunification of the country with the abolition of slavery within the rebelling states. And many of these men, that's not what they had signed up for. They had gone through 3 army commanders in 3 months. Burnside assumed command in November. Hooker assumed command in January. In 3 months, they'd gone through 3 army commanders. They now have a new war aim. Things are not looking good, and they've been beaten on every battlefield. Strong discontent within the Army of the Potomac, and this is what Joseph Hooker had to deal with. He's 48 years old, Joseph Hooker, in 1863. He was a West Point graduate, as were most of the large commanders at this point of the war. He had done well in his pre-war military career, but he did manage to tick off a lot of very important people. Joseph Hooker was a braggart, critical of his superiors. He was a schemer, and many considered him immoral. He left the Army, resigned in 1853 to become a farmer in Sonoma, California. He attempted to rejoin the Army in 1858 after farming didn't fare so well, but Winfield Scott, the highest ranking officer in the United States Army at that time, barred him from re-entering because Joseph Hooker had testified against Winfield Scott in an inquiry during the Mexican War. So Hooker had a tendency of running up against people, especially very important people. When the war began and after the First Battle of Manassas, Hooker gained an audience with Lincoln and flat out told him, "I am better than any general you had on that field." And Lincoln liked that. He wanted someone who was aggressive and had confidence. And so Hooker entered the Army. He worked his way up from brigade to division to corps. At the Battle of Fredericksburg, he commanded 1/3 of the Army under Burnside, was under his direct control. And he had earned the nickname Fighting Joe Hooker. It was a misprint in the newspaper. It was actually Fighting, Joe Hooker, but the comma was left out and he became Fighting Joe Hooker. But he loved to talk to the newspapers, and the newspapers loved what he had to say because it was typically very controversial. Hooker enters his job. He's got to rebuild this army and bring its spirit back. And the thing he does is tremendous. What he does. Reforms immediately are instituted in the Army of the Potomac. The Army was demoralized. Desertions were high. Poor food, clothing, equipment, medical care, everything. It was an army that was close to possibly dissolving for lack of morale. Amnesty for deserters. One of the first things. Any deserters who returned by April 1st, amnesty. No charges against you. Furloughs were granted. 2 men per 100 were allowed to go home. You could go visit your family. That did a lot. And when you came back, 2 more could go. For a week, you were allowed to go home and visit your family. Food was improved. Burnside had bakeries set up. So the men were getting fresh bread, soft bread. An army marches on its stomach. Good food goes a long way. So they were getting fresh bread. 140 cars daily, or 800 tons of material and food rolled into the Union Army. Compare that to 1 train for the Confederates coming up and down the rail line from Richmond. For the Union Army coming off the Potomac River along the rail line, they were getting 140 cars daily or 800 tons of material. Burnside's building that stockpile Lee could not have. He abolished clumsy grand divisions. That was where Burnside had divided the army into 3 groups known as grand divisions. All it was another level of bureaucracy. Hooker abolished that. To assist, Lincoln signed the first United States Army draft. Conscription. Men were being drafted in the Army. Confederates had done it a year earlier. But that brought more men into the Union Army. He developed the Bureau of Military Intelligence, spies, trying to get information. Not all Spotsylvanians were loyal to the Confederacy. There were a number of Spotsylvania residents, born Virginians, who spent the winter of 1862-63 going back and forth across this river, telling Joseph Hooker exactly where Lee's army was, the numbers of troops, and what was going on. He was getting information. He could gain intelligence about the other side. He improved sanitation, medical care. He instituted corps badges, distinctive badges to be worn by each corps. That created esprit de corps, wearing these badges. And in April, Abraham Lincoln came down and reviewed the army. The men could see the president. The president was down in their camps visiting them. All of this raised morale so that when Hooker's army took the field, 137,000 men strong. Largest army on the planet, 137,000 men. Robert E. Lee, 61,000. That's what Hooker has to work with for the campaign. Hooker also had to deal with personalities. He had to shuffle around some commanders and some corps commanders. Made some good decisions, maybe not some good decisions. 3rd Army Corps, its commander was sent over to command cavalry. One of the important things Hooker did was he brought all his cavalry together into its own organization. Just as Lee had previously his artillery scattered around, the Union Army had its cavalry, its horsemen scattered around, and that's why Jeb Stuart was able to embarrass them every day on the battlefield. And so Hooker brought them all together, created the Cavalry Corps, and put George Stoneman at its head. He had previously been an infantry commander in the Union Army's 3rd Infantry Corps. That position went to Dan Sickles, a very colorful man. Political general, former Democratic congressman from New York, had been tried for murder, and murdering his wife's lover, and was the very first man to ever get off a murder charge for temporary insanity. He lacked any military training, but he was recklessly courageous. The 5th Corps, George Meade, a man who would figure prominently in the Army just within a couple months' time. The 11th Corps went to Oliver Otis Howard. He was a pious New England native. He and his men did not get along. The 11th Corps was made up primarily, they were very decidedly of German flavor. Lots of immigrants, and there was tremendous mistrust between Howard and his men, and that would play out on May 2nd here at Chancellorsville. But Hooker had to figure out, all right, I've got 137,000 men. I have a stockpile of equipment. I know that Lee's struggling on the south side of the river. I know that James Longstreet has left. The spies are telling Hooker that Longstreet and 2 divisions have headed south. So I know that Lee's army is depleted. What do I do? Well, he'd been at Fredericksburg. I'm not going that route again. I'm not going to attack straight into town. I'm going to follow what Ambrose Burnside had tried to do in the mud, in the rain, in the snow. I'm going to take the Army and move it north and west along the river, crossing at various locations. The advantages for crossing upriver, the roads were much better, and the river was much narrower. I mean, this is much narrower than the Rappahannock River that flows through Fredericksburg. The disadvantages, however, was that as you headed north, you had to cross two rivers, not just one. When you look on your map, you had to deal with the Rappahannock, then you had to deal with the Rapidan, and the Rapidan flows into the Rappahannock just to our east. So you have two rivers to cross. Plus, you have to cover a fair amount of distance. Hooker's plans was first he was going to send George Stoneman, the cavalry commander, to take this new cavalry corps on its very first mission. Their job was to set out early, go all the way around into Culpeper County off to our west, cross and swing all the way south of Fredericksburg, miles south, tear up the railroad, disrupt telegraphic communication with Richmond, create chaos behind the Confederate lines. Also, if Hooker's plans work and Robert E. Lee retreats, there's cavalry waiting to slow him down and block his path, allowing Hooker to catch up and hold him in a trap. So the cavalry is sent out on April 13th, as I mentioned, but they immediately struggle. Because of rain, the rivers are high, getting across at these shallow points becomes extremely difficult, and it's not until April 27th that they are actually going to get across the river. Still, as we learned from our last stop, Lee doesn't know what on earth is going on. There are about 26,000 Union soldiers south of Fredericksburg, but where's the rest of the Army? They're moving up along the rivers. They're coming in to the west. On April 28th, two divisions of the Union Army's 2nd Corps make a demonstration, which basically means puffing out your chest, making a show, getting the enemy's attention at Banks Ford, which is off to our east. So Lee's looking at Banks Ford. He's looking below Fredericksburg. He's looking to the west. What on earth is going on? On April 29th, the 1st and the 6th Corps below Fredericksburg, the 11th and 12th Corps reach Germanna Ford off to our west. The 12th Corps crosses at Germanna Ford. They capture 103 Confederates that are out there, probably part of Anderson's division, men guarding these shallow points, these crossings. They actually get a pontoon bridge built, a floating bridge, and the 11th and 12th Corps are going to cross right over that bridge. 5 p.m. on April 29th, the Union Army is going to arrive here, opposite Ely's Ford. 1st Cavalry are going to splash across and then climb up the banks. There are Confederates here, part of Anderson's men, who are still out here watching. The cavalry come splashing across, literally right where we are, across the river, riding their horses across. It's shallow enough at certain times, and was in April of '63, that they could get across, come up the banks, and disperse the Confederates. The handful of Confederates up here go running back down Ely's Ford, heading towards Chancellorsville in safety. Behind them the next day, April 30th, comes the Union Army's 5th Corps under George Gordon Meade. This is where the 5th Corps is going to cross, the infantry. Now, the cavalry obviously has the ability to ride their horses across. So there's a certain amount of elevation you get as you're coming across. The infantrymen, not so much. There are no pontoon bridges being built here at this point. So the infantrymen have to wade across the river. Now, this created a tremendous amount of entertainment for these men. Because on the other side of the river, they take the time to undress. They're not coming across in their wool uniforms. A soldier in the 140th New York who came across here said, "There is no way to get across but to foot it on the bottom of the river. The water at the ford was about 3.5 feet deep, and on the bank of the river we were halted and ordered to strip. With cartridge boxes, guns, and clothes above water, all went into the famous Rapidan." It was a fine picture on that moonlit evening. They're coming very early in the morning to see the thousands of men with all their fixtures around their necks marching across. A soldier from Massachusetts said, "The men took off their clothes and held them on their heads, and it was a singular sight to see the army marching down the ford with nothing but shirts and coats. One officer, I remember, took off his pants and drawers and gave them to a soldier to carry over, but could not find him after he got across. So that he was dancing about with nothing but his blouse and sword for a long time. Don't give your clothes to another man when you're crossing the river. Another soldier in the 140th New York. Since we crossed the Rappahannock in such style, fording the Rapidan should be shoulder deep by moonlight. Since we crossed the Rappahannock in such style, fording the Rapidan shoulder deep by moonlight, Hooker's stock is rising. He furnishes the brains, the army the legs, and I think the legs have won. Hooker is a brick of the genuine kind. Now this is an army that was in the almost revolt just a few months before, as just the discontent and depression over what had happened the previous year. And think about the Union soldier at this point. Ambrose Burnside had led them to almost slaughter at Fredericksburg, and in some cases had, up against a stone wall. They had to fight to get across that river. There was the shelling of the town to get across the river. There was death and destruction to get across the river. And what are they doing here? A river that had caused them so much trouble, the Rappahannock above and now the Rapidan here, they're laughing at each other. They're having a good time. Morale in the Union Army is at an all-time high. Joseph Hooker has 137,000 men who are laughing at each other as they're crossing into enemy territory and into battle. In just a few months, Hooker had turned this army around. These were men who looked up to Hooker, and these were men who expected him to change everything. He changed everything so far, but he would change things on the battlefield as well. And that was how they felt as they came across this river right here. At 7:30, the men bivouacked near the river. This is the evening of April 30th. Wood being plentiful, huge fires soon lit up the country. Frolicsome and joyous, yet edging up to the impending battle, our command dropped off into welcome slumber. So again, Union Army that had been so downtrodden just a couple months earlier was now, they were ready to take on Robert E. Lee. Morale was high. They were getting good food. They had the equipment they needed. They were twice the number of their opponent in the army. Things were looking good. And here, they got across the river without firing a single shot. Two rivers, the Rappahannock and then the Rapidan. They had to fight across at Fredericksburg, but here they just walked across, laughing at each other and making fun of each other. So things were looking very good. This is April 30th, 1863. But all that's going to change the next day, May 1st, because that's when they're actually going to come into conflict with the Confederate Army here at Chancellorsville. So if we were standing here May 1st, 1863, 150 years ago, there would still be a line of Union soldiers coming across this river. More troops were coming. Those that had crossed on the 30th camped for the night. On the 1st, they're moving down. Some had moved down on April 30th towards Chancellorsville, getting toward Hooker's objective, which was the Chancellorsville intersection. All roads lead to Chancellorsville. 11th and 12th Corps coming in from the west. The other corps coming across here. Get to Chancellorsville where those roads meet and all the army meets. Hooker can concentrate his army, bring its full numbers to bear. Robert E. Lee will surely choose not to do battle. He would be foolish to take on this massive Union army. He will definitely, in Hooker's mind, Robert E. Lee will definitely leave the battlefield and retreat south. That's what Joseph Hooker's thinking. So with that, let's get back on the bus. We'll leave Ely's Ford. We'll head to the Chancellorsville intersection.